I see lots of friends.
I've seen a couple authors who are part of our Saber series this year also joining us. So that's good too. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. As people trickle in, I just want to give a little introduction. Um, my name's Katie. I work at the Babe Ruth Museum, and the idea for this session kind of came up because, it's been 90 years since Babe visited Japan on the All-Star Tour, and to this day, we get so many Japanese fans who visit, you know, still like have that great fascination with the Babe, as we all do, I think. And with the rise of Shohei Ohtani, those comparisons start flying. And it's a cool time to witness, a baseball player of a huge magnitude, sort of like what Babe Ruth was when he was playing, in the 1920s and 1930s. Um, so Rob is our guest tonight. He is an award-winning author. He was an archaeologist. He's the founder of Saber's Asian Baseball Committee, um, Japanese baseball historian. I think your newest book is about baseball cards, Japanese baseball cards. So any questions we all have about Japanese baseball, baseball cards, Babe in Japan, we're going to try to get them all out of here tonight. So Rob is going to give us a little presentation, and then after that, we'll open the floor up to some questions. So if everyone can, mute their microphones until the end, that would be great. If you want to turn your camera off, you can. And yeah, so we'll check back in and we'll do some Q&A at the end there. And if you are a Sabre member or a member of the Babe Ruth Museum, these are the kind of programs that we like to offer for free. We haven't done as many virtual programs this year. So there is no like charge to watch this tonight. But if you want to make a donation to the Babe Ruth Museum, we would really appreciate that. And that's what makes it possible for us to do programs like this. So I'll put that link in the chat. And then, Rob, you can take it away.
Hey, thank you so much. And it is wonderful to be here tonight. And so many names I recognize, from my mother-in-law to many, many friends from both Japan and the United States. Sabre members, welcome all, and thanks for turning in. So, what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to give an outline on the 1934 tour of Japan. It should last about 30 minutes. And that'll give us plenty of time for questions, not only about the 34 tour, but also about Japanese baseball. So, at the end of the presentation, feel free to ask me about what's going on with Roki Sasaki or Otani or whatever you want to do about Japanese baseball, and I'll see what I can do. So I'm going to start by seeing if I can share my screen and starting my PowerPoint presentation. All right. Hopefully, can somebody raise their hand if they can see that? Or Katie, can you see that all right?
Yes, looks good.
Okay, great. So here we go. On the morning of February 22nd, 1935, Katsuse Nagasaki loitered outside the Yomiuri newspaper's Tokyo offices. As Matsutara Shiriki, the owner of the Yomiuri newspaper, arrived at work, Nagasaki strode forward, pulling a short samurai sword from beneath his coat, and struck Shiriki in the head before fleeing. Later that day, Nagasaki walked into a local police station and gave a detailed confession. The primary reason for the assassination attempt? Shiriki had defiled the memory of the Meiji Emperor by allowing Babe Ruth and his team of American All-Stars to play in the stadium named in his honor. 3 months earlier, nearly 500,000 fans had lined the streets of Tokyo to welcome the ball players to Japan. The All-Americans were probably the greatest barnstorming team ever assembled. It included 7 future Hall of Famers. Headlining the squad were Lou Gehrig and Babe Ruth. But the team also included Jimmy Fox, Earl Averill, Charlie Gehringer, Lefty Gomez, Lefty O'Doul, Connie Mack, and a backup catcher named Mo Berg. Now, Berg was a Princeton and Columbia Law School graduate who had a gift for languages, causing one teammate to quip that Berg could speak a dozen languages but couldn't hit in any of them. Berg would eventually become an operative for the OSS, the forerunner of the CIA, and many believe that this trip to Japan was his first mission as a spy. As the parade went through Tokyo, thousands waved American and Japanese flags and yelled, Banzai, Babe Ruth. The crowd rushed into the street to be closer to the Babe, and traffic stood still for hours as Babe shook hands with thousands. Ruth and his teammates stayed in Japan for a month, playing 18 games in 12 cities. But there was more at stake than baseball. Japan and the United States were slipping towards war as the two nations vied for control over China and naval supremacy in the Pacific. Politically, Japan was in turmoil. From the 1880s through 1920s, Japan enjoyed a form of democracy. It saw great strides in modernization and a flourishing of the arts and close ties to the United States. Yet, as Japan's power grew, so did its nationalism. A growing minority felt that Japan should take its place among the world powers by expanding its military and colonizing its neighbors. Ultranationalist societies began assassinating liberal politicians and members of the free press. By the early 1930s, the civilian government could no longer control elements of the military. In 1931, nationalistic officers engineered the invasion of Manchuria. War between the United States and Japan seemed inevitable. Politicians on both sides of the Pacific hoped that the goodwill generated by the tour and the two nations' shared love of baseball could help heal these growing political differences. Many observers, therefore, considered the All-Stars' joyous reception significant. The New York Times, for example, wrote, "The Babe's big bulk today blotted out such unimportant things as international squabbles over oil and navies." But as we will see, not all Japanese wish the nations reunited. The 1934 tour began not as a diplomatic mission, but as a publicity stunt to attract readers to the Yomiuri Shimbun. Matsutaro Shiriki had purchased the financially troubled newspaper in 1924 and quickly turned it into Tokyo's third largest daily by increasing its entertainment sections. Now, baseball, which is called yakyu in Japanese, was and still is Japan's most popular sport. In 1872, an American teacher named Horace Wilson introduced the game to Japan. The game flourished in Tokyo and Kobe. By 1900, most schools across Japan had created baseball teams. And in 1908, professional American teams began visiting Japan. In 1931, Shiriki decided to bolster his sports coverage by sponsoring a team of American All-Stars to play in Japan. The team, which included Lou Gehrig and Lefty Grove and 5 other future Hall of Famers, won each of its 17 games. But Shiriki wasn't satisfied. The Major League team had lacked the greatest drawing card in baseball, Babe Ruth. Shiriki immediately began to organize a second tour. Working closely with Satoru Suzuki, a sports writer who had lived in New York for a decade, and National League batting champion Lefty O'Doul, Shiriki lined up the powerful 1934 squad. Most of the players' wives accompanied their husbands on the tour, and the Ruths brought along 18-year-old daughter Julia. The tourists boarded the luxury liner, the Empress of Japan in Vancouver, and after a stop in Honolulu, arrived in Yokohama on November 2nd. Now, in 1934, Japan did not have a professional league. To challenge the Americans, Shiriki brought together Japan's best amateur players to form the All-Nippon team. The team included 11 future members of the Japan Hall of Fame and numerous colorful personalities. But tonight, I will mention just two. The first was hard to miss. Blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and 6'3", 18-year-old Victor Starfin was the son of Russian refugees who escaped the Russian Revolution. After years on the run, the family settled in Hokkaido. Young Victor fell in love with baseball and soon became a regional star. He hoped to play college ball, but in 1933, his father was convicted of murdering a young Russian woman who worked in his tea shop. Shiriki promised to use his influence to help Victor's father if the young man would forsake college and play on the All-Nippon team. The All-Nippon squad also included a young American who hoped to become the first ethnic Japanese to make the major leagues. Jimmy Horia was born in Hawaii and left for California to follow his dream. He played semi-pro for several years without making it into organized baseball. Hearing that Shiriki was creating a team to challenge the All-Americans, Horia traveled to Tokyo to try out. He hoped that a stellar performance against the All-Americans would lead to a major league contract. So the tour began with 2 games in Tokyo's Meiji Jingu Stadium. Many believed that the All-Nippon would give the major leaguers a close game, but it soon became apparent that the hosts were outmatched. Soon the fans were cheering for the All-Americans to hit home runs, and they especially wanted to see Babe Ruth go deep. The fans followed Babe's every move. A reporter wrote, "The fans went crazy each time Ruth did anything, smiled, sneezed, or dropped the ball." Next, the All-Americans traveled north. As they boarded a ferry to cross the straits to reach Hokkaido, officials handed each traveler a small map with 3 coastal regions circled in red. Large cursive writing proclaimed, "Photographing, sketching, surveying, recording, flying over the fortified area without the authorization of the commanding officer of this fortress is strictly prohibited by order." The handout was no mere threat. Japan was paranoid about espionage, and officials even inspected Ruth during the trip to make sure he wasn't taking photographs of sensitive areas. But the warning did not stop Mo Berg, who whipped out his camera and filmed the area. The 2 teams played in the northern provinces, enduring bone-chilling winds and frosted fields. Once again, the Americans won comfortably, and Babe Ruth hit his first home run of the tour. Now, as the teams returned to Tokyo, a small group of Army officers from the military academy met in an isolated restaurant. Their purpose was to overthrow the Japanese government. The Great Depression had hit rural Japan particularly hard, leading to widespread starvation. At the same time, large trading companies flourished in the unstable markets and rampant inflation. The conspirators, led by Captain Koji Muranaka, belonged to the loosely organized Young Officers movement. The young officers felt that Japan's government had betrayed its citizens by putting the interests of big business before the welfare of the populace. The group advocated the violent overthrow of civilian rule, the declaration of martial law, and the emperor taking direct control of the government. They believed the emperor would end rural poverty by redistributing wealth and lead Japan to world prominence by conquering Asia. On November 27th, Japan's parliament would meet in a special session. Once the politicians gathered, the young officers and the troops planned to attack the Diet building, slaughter the civilian government, and seize power. No mention was made of Babe Ruth and the ball players. But as the Imperial Hotel, which is seen to the right, circled in red, faced the Emperor's Palace and was just a few blocks from the Diet building, seen in the left in red, Muranaka's plan put the Americans in a line of fire. Meanwhile, the ball clubs stayed in the Tokyo area for about a week, playing 4 official games and 1 scrimmage. The All-Americans won all 4 comfortably, scoring 60 runs while surrendering just 10. The Americans also continued their role as goodwill ambassadors by attending parties and events. Now, although baseball is the national pastime of both the US and Japan, the nations approached the game differently. The Japanese approached baseball as a martial art. They emphasized strict discipline and long hours of grueling practice, not only to improve the players' skills, but also their mental endurance and their fighting spirit. This approach offered hope to the all-Nippon team. Infielder Tokyo Tominaga told reporters, "Many fans think that the small Japanese can never compete with the large Americans, but I disagree. The Japanese are equal to the Americans in the strength of spirit." On November 20th, a 17-year-old Japanese pitcher's spirit was nearly strong enough to conquer the All-Americans. Aided by the midday sun in the batter's eyes, Eiji Sawamura pitched the game of his life in a small town of Shizuoka at the foot of Mount Fuji. He recorded 11 straight outs, including consecutive strikeouts of Gehringer, Ruth, Gehrig, and Fox, before the Bambino broke up his no-hitter. The shutout continued until Gehrig homered in the 7th to give the Americans a 1-0 victory. Sawamura became a national hero. Although the Japanese had not won, they showed that they were capable of beating their opponents. The game would become a symbol of Japan's struggles against the West. Many Japanese felt that with enough fighting spirit, their countrymen could surpass the major leaguers, just as they believed their military would surpass the Western powers. Now, Captain Koji Muranaka's plans to seize control of Japan were almost ready. But the same day as Sawamura pitched his masterpiece, the plot was uncovered, and Muranaka and his conspirators were arrested. News of the plot would remain hidden until 1946. Only a handful of men knew that bloodshed, revolt, and perhaps even civil war had nearly disrupted the All-American Baseball Tour. Sawamura's near victory gave All Nippon confidence as the 2 teams embarked on a 6-game junket of Western Japan. Their 1,000-mile journey included stops in Nagoya, Osaka, Kokura, and Kyoto. At Nagoya, the Japanese once again nearly upset the Americans, entering the bottom of the 8th with a 5-3 lead, but several poor decisions by the Japanese manager cost them the game. After the 2 close games, the All-Americans increased their focus and won the remaining 6 games easily by a combined 80-17 score. The game In November, the November 16th game in Kokura provided one of the most enduring images of the tour. Driving rain turned the field into mud and prompted Ruth and others to play the game in rubber boots. At one point, the Babe huddled under an umbrella while playing first base. Few, however, know the other interesting event that happened during this game. In the fifth inning, with bases loaded and a 3-0 count and 5'1" Shinji Hamazaki on the mound, the Babe stepped out of the batter's box and pointed to the outfield bleachers. Unlike his famed 1932 called shot, there was no doubt about what Ruth meant this time. And sure enough, the Sultan's swat crushed the next pitch over the right field wall onto the roof of an adjacent building, shattering its clay roofing tiles. Now, throughout the tour, Mo Berg would leave the group and explore on his own. Wherever he went, he took numerous pictures and videos, such as this one here, which is from the Berg collection. On November 29th, Berg informed Connie Mack that he felt unwell and would miss the afternoon's game. Immediately after the team left for the ballpark, Berg dressed in a kimono and combed his hair in a Japanese style. He headed southeast through Ginza to St. Luke's International Hospital, a tall structure with panoramic views of Tokyo. Pretending to visit the American ambassador's daughter, Berg took the elevator to the top floor and then climbed the spiral staircase to the top of St. Luke's Tower. There, he pulled out his movie camera, panning the skyline, and took these pictures. During World War II, Berg became a spy for the OSS. He was even sent on a mission to assassinate Werner Heisenberg, the leading German physicist, if he had evidence that Heisenberg was close to creating an atomic weapon. Now, many believe, as I said before, that this trip to Japan was Berg's first mission as a spy. But in truth, there's no evidence to support this, other than Berg's bizarre behavior. Now, personally, I believe that the trip was a pivotal point in Berg's espionage career, but not because it was his first mission, but because it sowed the seeds for his future career as a spy. It was while shooting clandestine shots for the thrill of it that Berg found his true calling. On December 2nd, thousands of fans came to Ueno Station to say sayonara to the team. Several of the American players wept openly during the goodbye speeches. Capitalizing on the tour's success, Shiriki kept the All-Nippon team intact and organized the Nippon Professional Baseball League. Shiriki's squad, renamed the Tokyo Yomiuri Giants, success tact. All right, is that done? Shiriki's squad, renamed the Tokyo Yomiuri Giants, barnstormed in North America in 1935 and 1936 and went on to dominate the Japanese league for decades. And thanks to the Babe, the tour was a diplomatic success. Connie Mack summed up the consensus that the trip did more for the better understanding between Japanese and Americans than all the diplomatic exchanges ever accomplished, and assured listeners that there would be no war between the United States and Japan. The Sporting News added, "We believe that the recent trip has served to delay, if not prevent, any possible conflict. We would like to believe that countries having such a common interest in a great sport would rather fight it out on the diamond than on the battlefield." But it did not take long for that feeling to vanish. 4 weeks after the tour, Japan pulled out of the Washington Naval Treaty, which had limited the size of the major powers' navies. 2 months later, Nagasaki attacked Shiriki. Details of Muranaka's failed coup were not made public, but the military let the rebels off with only a 6-month suspension from active duty. A year later, on February 26, 1936, Muranaka joined 23 other young officers in a violent rebellion that assassinated several high-ranking government officials and narrowly missed the prime minister. Rival military units crushed the rebels and arrested its leaders. 19, including Muranaka, were executed. Despite the coup's failure, the events led to a series of civilian governments more sympathetic to the military's nationalist agenda. In July 1937, Japan invaded China. Whatever hope there had been for reconciliation between the United States and Japan vanished. Now, Babe Ruth took the attack on Pearl Harbor personally. He threw open the windows of his 15th floor New York apartment and began tossing out souvenirs from his trip to Japan. He became very active in the war effort, raising money through public appearances. Eiji Sawamura was also an active participant, serving 3 tours in the Japanese army. He also wrote war propaganda before being killed in action in 1944. But several of the friendships cemented during the 1934 trip survived the war and helped reconcile the two nations. Lefty O'Doul remained close both to Shiriki and also to Satoru Suzuki. And in 1946, he went to Japan, paying his own way, to rekindle these friendships and to restart Japanese baseball. O'Doul returned in 1949 with his San Francisco Seals, with the mission to help repair ties between the two nations. And once again, baseball was used as a diplomatic tool to help bring the nations closer together, but this time with lasting success. We're ready for questions.
So interesting. I did not know the other stuff that was happening at that time. Just makes, that tour all the more interesting. Okay, so let's go. Karen, you got your hand up. You can unmute and ask your question.
Hey, is this I was watched, The Catcher was a spy? Is this the same Mulberg?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yep.
I knew that he spoke so many languages.
Did you see the Hollywood version or the documentary version of the Moberg story?
Oh, unfortunately, the Hollywood one.
Try the documentary. It's quite good.
Okay. Thank you. That was really good.
Thank you.
All right. Mark, I saw your camera come up, or Tom, if you have a question. Either one want to go? Nope. Frank, did you have a question? Oh, Tom, go ahead.
I have a question.
Ask away.
Okay. If the assassination attempts by the Japanese military failed, who made the decision to invade Manchuria? Was the civil government so weak that the army or the military, who makes the decision to go to war in Manchuria and then China? You know?
Yes, in 1931, what happened was the army wanted to become more aggressive and start the war with China. So they they sabotaged the bridge. They sabotaged their own bridge, actually, and they blamed it on the Chinese. And That started the Manchurian War in 31. And once the military basically just took control of it and started the war, the government was so weak that they did not do anything other than support it.
Thank you.
Frank, go ahead.
Uh, I really enjoyed your presentation, Rob. Very informative. I also enjoyed your book. It was extremely well done. I've written a book about Babe Ruth going to Cuba, and one of the things that stuck out was the amount of money Babe Ruth was paid to go to Cuba. It was a full year's salary. Do you have any information about the financial arrangements for the tour to Japan?
You know what? I never came across that, and that's a really good question. I'm sure the players did very well, but I never saw any accounts of the tour.
I have a second question. You mentioned the resurgence of American baseball and interest in Japan after the war. Do you have any information about General MacArthur's role in fostering baseball in Japan after the war?
Absolutely. So GHQ purposely used baseball to build Japanese morale and also to help reunite the countries. There's a famous story where they were having a meeting, I believe it was 40, it's probably about 47, 1947. And they were having a staff meeting, and General McCark, William McCark, I can't remember the first name, was in charge of the economic development. And he had an aide de camp named Cappy Harada, who was a Nisei. And Cappy was in charge of all sports in Japan. And supposedly MacArthur gets up and he's kind of talking out loud and he says, now, how do we get this morale up? The morale of the Japanese people is so low. And Cappy supposedly stood up and said, baseball, sir, we should sponsor a team of baseball players to come over. And that supposedly led to Lefty O'Doul's 1949 tour. Now, Cappy was a promoter and a wonderful self-promoter. So we don't really know how truthful that story is, but it's a good story.
The best ones always are, you know. Aaron, did you have a question? No? Okay. I have a question. I guess I'm pivoting to baseball cards. What is, you know, like Babe's rookie card, extremely rare card? What is like the creme de la creme of Japanese cards?
There really isn't one. If a card survived of A.G. Salamora, that would be it. But there are no known baseball cards between 1937, the start of the war with China, and the end of World War II. And since Salamora died during the war, there are no cards of him that we know of. That would be the holy grail if
Right.
it exists. And one may exist, but no one's come across it.
Okay, thank you. Kevin, do you have a question?
I do. Well, first of all, thank you, Rob, for everything that you've done in terms of, you know, giving us all a great history of Japanese baseball and American and Japanese tours. I'm curious about if there is any information or any knowledge about what it was that Mo Berg was up to while he was in Japan. And were there targeted sites? Was there targeted information, targeted stuff that they were telling him to go and get?
Okay. So I've done personal research, and Nicholas Davidov, who's written a wonderful book on Mo Berg, has also gone into the archives and looked at Berg in Japan. And neither one of us found any evidence that Berg was working for the government in 1934. I was able to go through his declassified OSS papers. I was also able to go through the declassified papers of the American ambassador, who certainly would have known if Berg was a spy. And there's no mention of Berg. And there's no mention in the OSS papers of Japan, other than Berg coming in to OSS and saying, hey, I've got these pictures. They may be useful to you. And to me, that's not quite a smoking gun, but if he was already working for the government, he wouldn't have gone in 7 years later and said, "Hey, I got these pictures." The government would have already known about them. So that's where I've reached my conclusions. Davidoff has reached his conclusions that at this time, Berg was not working for the government, despite some of the things you will read.
Thank you. I also want to point out that at one time in my possession, I did have a baseball signed by the American team of the 34 tour. And if I remember right, it was 17 Hall of Famers.
17 sounds a little bit high, unless you had the Japanese on there as well.
It might well have been a few, but yeah, the most prominent signature besides Babe Ruth on the sweet spot was Charles Gehringer.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you again. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
All right. Other questions? Sure, Mark.
I got another one.
Hold on.
I got another one.
Okay, Tom, go ahead while Mark's
Yeah.
Okay, you
Go
said
ahead.
that the tour, they got a boat in Vancouver, British Columbia. Wasn't there any boat? Didn't the Japanese commercial buses land in San Francisco or Seattle? Why did they take a boat from Vancouver and not in the United States to
The
Japan?
Empress of Japan was what the QE2 would be in the 1960s. It was the greatest luxury liner in the world. So if Babe Ruth was going, they went to Vancouver to pick it up. That's the answer.
all right, Mark.
Yeah, let's try again. Sorry. Thanks, Rob, for your book. I enjoyed that and the talk tonight very much. Did Ruth lead the All-Americans in batting during that tour, despite being past his peak with players like Gehrig and Fox on the tour? I know Fox was recovering from being beaten, but that's one question. And the other one is, are there many other Japanese currently playing in Japan who are pitching as well as being in the lineup on days they're not pitching, like Otani?
The first question is, I'd have to look at the stats again, but I am pretty sure that Ruth led the team in home runs, RBI, and I think he also did in batting average. But then I just have to check the appendix of the book. Yeah, but he was a star there, and as people probably know, I didn't get into this during the presentation. He was released by the Yankees only about a month before this tour. He didn't know what he was going to do for the upcoming season. So in a way, he had a lot to prove, and he did prove it while he was over there. As for the second question, as far as I know, there is nobody in the Japanese major leagues that's a two-way player right now. I do know there's a couple young players who maybe are thinking about it. They may be in the minor leagues or they may still be in college, but I don't know their names. I've just heard people talk about them.
Thank you.
Scott, did you have a question?
Yes, I did. Rob, thanks for the presentation. Very good. Although Babe Ruth didn't go over to Japan until 1935, they did have the 1929 Shonen postcard of Babe Ruth in Japan. Is that just because he was so popular around the world?
That's correct. So, as you know, Babe Ruth is the most popular baseball player probably of all time. And so he appears on English tobacco cards. He appears on also this Japanese insert from the 1920s. Yeah.
Thanks.
And I might also throw out that he appears on numerous Japanese baseball magazine covers prior to this tour as well.
Kevin, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I just have another question. Do you have any updates about what is going on with Meiji Jingu Stadium? There was proposals when I was there in 2019 that they were going to be tearing it down for the Olympics, which didn't happen. And I'm just curious if they are making any progress with preserving the stadium.
Last time I heard, which was probably a few weeks ago, they are still planning on tearing down the stadium and redoing the whole section. I don't know.
Yeah, it's
The
such a
outside
beautiful
is
thing.
nice. The inside is horrible. It's the smallest seats, the dirtiest bathrooms, the worst concourse. I'm not a fan.
I understand that. At the same time, you look out there and you go, "Oh well, all the players that played here." It's like looking at Fenway Park.
That is true. Yeah. Perhaps they could gut it and redo it. Perhaps there is challenges to the redevelopment because Meiji Jingu Park is a beautiful, we'll call it rural park in the middle of Tokyo, and there's a lot of trees there, and the redevelopment plans would impact a lot of the trees. So the best way to save the park is actually through environmental laws because they're impacting the greenery of the park.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Frank.
Uh, Rob, you mentioned Roki Sasaki earlier. What's your assessment of where he's going to end up?
Or where he's going to go up, I have no idea. I mean, I've heard rumors for over a year that he's already, quote, signed with the Dodgers, that's the only team he's interested in. I don't know. Roki is very young. He's only pitched a couple seasons in Japan, and he has not pitched a full season without injury yet. He throws very hard. He's a powerful and talented pitcher. But the question is, if he's a power pitcher in Japan, how will that translate to a league full of power pitchers? So he could do well, but I would not be shocked if he's kind of a bust.
100 miles an hour in Japan is still 100 miles an hour here.
Yeah, but he's the only one doing it in Japan, right? So.
All right. Any other questions? You can also type your question if you don't want to read it out. I guess I have another question. So what's your take on the Ruth and Otani matchup? I think ours, speaking from the museum, it's too early to make that comparison, but what's your take?
What's the take? I mean, I still feel that Ruth was the greatest baseball player of all time because you have to judge a baseball player within the context he played in. And Ruth dominated the leagues for so long and was considered one of the greatest athletes of his time. I mean, not all around athlete, of course, but within the sport, he dominated his sport so well. I love Otani. He's my favorite player, but he's not quite as dominating as Ruth was during his time period. But I mean, one-on-one, I think Otani is a much better athlete. I think the players today are so strong and so athletic compared to back in the 20s and 30s.
Very true. Very true. All right.
Carl Law, how are you?
How you doing, Rob?
I'm doing well.
Hey, I don't have a question, but being the least knowledgeable of anything about baseball, I really enjoyed your talk. And I had no idea the connection between baseball and the history between the United States and Japan during World War II. This was really fascinating. I'm actually going to buy all your books now.
Oh, thank you, Carl. Carl is my college roommate. So thanks so much for tuning in.
All right. Any other questions? Right. Yeah, definitely check out Rob's books. You've got them all listed on your website. You've got your Japanese baseball cards for sale. There's a link to your eBay profile, and I've got one that I've got my eye on already.
Great.
Thank you so much for doing this. It's so fascinating to hear all of these different angles. And 90 years later to still be talking about it and learning new things is really, really incredible. So yeah, thank you so much. Everyone, if you are able to, we would love for you to make a donation. Your donations power sessions like this and, help us do what we do. So we really appreciate it. Rob, thank you so much for taking the time. I know we all learned a lot, and thank you.
My pleasure. And if anybody has questions that think of later, or they don't feel like sharing in front of everybody, feel free to email me. I'm easy to find.
All right. All right.
All
Thank
right.
you all.
Thank you, Katie.
Have a good night.
Good night.
Bye. Good night.